She pushed my disabled son into a river, all because his wheelchair ruined her perfect street. I'm a former drill sergeant, and this HOA Karen picked the wrong father to bully. What started as petty fines over a wheelchair ramp spiraled into her filming us, threatening our safety, and finally, attempted murder. But crossing a soldier who's fought real battles? Big mistake. This is how a tyrant with a clipboard learned, mess with my son, and you'll face a war you can't win. It all began on our first day in Whitewood Lane. Boxes still cluttered the yard, my arms ached from unloading, and Nathan, my 11-year-old son, was exploring our new home in his wheelchair. That's when I saw her. Karen, the HOA president, standing across the street with a clipboard and a razor-thin smile. Little did I know she'd turn our fresh start into a battle for survival. She didn't wait for an invitation. She marched straight over and stopped a couple of feet from me, clipboard in hand, her expression like a drill sergeant sizing up a rookie who'd shown up late. "You're the new family," she said, not quite making it a question. "I'm Karen, president of our homeowners association." I wiped my forehead. "Nice to meet you. I'm Jake. My son and I just moved in." Her gaze flicked to the boxes, then back to me. "We run a tight ship here. Standards are high. I hope you can respect that." Her tone dripped with condescension, implying that if I'd never heard of an HOA, it was time to bow to her rules. I nodded, trying to stay courteous. "I appreciate that. We're excited to be part of the community." She didn't offer a welcome. Instead, she glanced at the moving truck parked at the curb. "That's been blocking the street for hours. You really should have scheduled a shorter unloading window so it wouldn't be such an eyesore." Her choice of words, eyesore, clanged in my mind. It was a moving truck, not a dumpster, but I swallowed my frustration, refusing to escalate things on day one. "We're moving as fast as we can. It'll be gone soon." Karen nodded once, though it wasn't a friendly motion, more like a final verdict. "See that it is." And with that, she turned and headed back across the street. I stood there in the driveway, watching her go, unsettled by how she'd spoken to me like a subordinate. In the army, I'd dealt with tough superiors and rebellious recruits, but this was supposed to be my place of peace, away from barking orders and endless confrontation. Shaking it off, I went back to unloading, determined to focus on setting up our new home for Nathan. He rolled outside to check on me, his eyes bright. "Dad, this place is huge compared to our old house," he said, hands gripping the wheels of his chair with excitement. "I can actually move around without bumping into things." I smiled, reminded why we'd chosen this neighborhood. "That was the goal, buddy. You deserve space to live comfortably." He glanced across, noticing Karen stepping onto her porch again, her phone raised. She seemed to be filming us. Nathan frowned. "Is she recording us?" I exhaled, tension rippling through my shoulders. "Probably just a nosy neighbor. Don't worry about it." But inwardly, I was on alert. I'd never encountered a neighbor so blatant in her intrusion. It struck me as suspicious, but I tried to stay calm. We spent the rest of the day arranging furniture, plugging in appliances, and stacking boxes in each room. By late evening, I was exhausted. Nathan was nodding off in his chair, so I wheeled him to his new bedroom, spacious, well lit, with a wide doorway. He gave me a sleepy grin and said, "Dad, this is going to be awesome." I looked at him, heart swelling with hope. "Yeah," I murmured, hoping I was right. That hope lasted until the next morning. We were up early, determined to knock out more unpacking. I had a sledgehammer propped by the porch steps, ready to begin the process of installing a ramp. Nathan's old house had been a minefield of narrow hallways and cramped doorways, but this one was prime for modifications. I'd done my research. Nothing in the HOA guidelines explicitly forbade ramps. If anything, they implied that accessibility was allowed, though subject to certain permits. I planned to handle that paperwork, but my priority was Nathan's safety. I'd barely swung the hammer twice when Karen came marching across the street again, wearing an expensive-looking jogging outfit and holding a to-go coffee cup. She glared at me as if I'd committed a crime. "What do you think you're doing?" I turned, sweat rolling down my temple. "Morning, Karen. I'm installing a ramp for my son's wheelchair." She sipped her coffee, eyes narrowing. "Without submitting the plans to the HOA board first, that's a violation of protocol. A major structural alteration requires approval. You can't just destroy the porch steps." I wiped my brow. "It's not destruction, it's an upgrade. My son needs easier access." Karen's tone. "We have an aesthetic standard here. A big concrete ramp out front is going to look unsightly, not to mention decrease property values." My grip on the hammer tightened. I'd faced off against recruits who screamed in my face, but my patience held steady. Karen, this is about my son's mobility. I'm not building a neon sign, it's a ramp. She let out a humorless laugh. If your situation is that serious, maybe you should have picked a different house, one with a built-in ramp, or a different neighborhood altogether. That statement hit me like a punch. Are you suggesting my son's disability isn't welcome here? She shrugged, maintaining eye contact as though daring me to argue. I'm suggesting you follow the rules. I'm head of this HOA, and I take that responsibility very seriously. I spent a good part of that morning stewing over her words. Her clear implication was that a disabled child was a burden on the neighborhood. My anger simmered beneath the surface, but I reminded myself that losing my temper wouldn't fix anything. Nathan's well-being was paramount. I needed to get the ramp built, file the paperwork if necessary, and ensure we wouldn't be forced to undo it. Later that day, as I was mixing concrete, a friendly neighbor named Linda strolled over. She handed me a glass of lemonade and said quietly, "I saw Karen giving you a hard time. She does that to everyone, but she's being particularly spiteful to you." I asked if there was a reason. Linda sighed, shifting uneasily. She likes to micromanage. Anyone who breaks from her standards is a target. But a ramp? She'll cling to any excuse to say it's against regulations. I thanked Linda, relieved to see not everyone on Whitewood Lane shared Karen's hostility. "I'll handle it," I said. "I'm not backing down." Linda smiled, sympathy in her eyes. "I hope you don't. Most of us have just learned to keep our heads down." That told me everything I needed to know. Karen had established a culture of fear, using HOA guidelines like weapons. People went along to avoid being singled out. But I wasn't built to submit to tyranny, especially not when it involved my child's basic rights. Determined to keep up the momentum, I spent the following week juggling work, unpacking, and finishing the ramp. Nathan watched with excitement, occasionally offering to fetch tools. He wanted to help, but I insisted he rest his arms. The project required heavy lifting and precise measurements, and I didn't want him straining himself. Still, his grin whenever I poured a fresh layer of concrete reminded me why this mattered so much. One morning, I was smoothing the final layer when I heard a sharp "hey" behind me. I turned to see Karen again, hands on her hips, flanked by two other women. They looked like her disciples, nodding dutifully as she spoke. She prodded the ramp with her foot, lips pressed tight. "Still working on this eyesore, I see. Did you at least submit an official?" I pressed my trowel into the concrete, refusing to lose my composure. "I'll submit whatever forms you need, but the ramp's staying." She smirked, flicking her gaze to one of the women at her side. "We'll see. The board meets next week. If we vote it down, you'll have to remove it." I stood, setting my tools aside. "By all means, vote however you like. But there are federal laws that protect people with disabilities, Karen. Your HOA rules can't override them." Her smirk vanished. She clearly didn't like being challenged. "We'll see about that," she repeated. Then, casting one more disdainful glance at the ramp, she spun around and marched away. I shook my head, my heart pounding with a mix of anger and adrenaline. My time in the service taught me to pick my battles, but this one wasn't optional. I would fight for my son. Despite Karen's hostility, the new ramp proved an instant blessing for Nathan. He glided up it smoothly, no longer needing me to lift him over steps or struggle with shaky wooden boards. I saw the pride in his eyes, and it reinforced my conviction that I'd done the right thing. Let Karen call it an eyesore. Our property values didn't mean a thing compared to Nathan's freedom. Meanwhile, Linda informed me about an upcoming HOA festival by the river. She said it was one of the biggest community gatherings of the year, featuring food stalls, games, and live music. "I know you've had a rough start with Karen," she told me, "but you might like meeting the rest of the neighborhood. Plenty of folks here are kind." I considered her words. The idea of exposing Nathan to more potential criticism from Karen made me uneasy, but he deserved a chance to enjoy the local events. I decided to ask Nathan how he felt. He brightened at the mention of a festival, already picturing carnival games and funnel cake. "Let's go," he said. "We can leave if it gets weird." I couldn't argue with that logic. We set our sights on Saturday afternoon, hoping Karen would be too busy to bother. Yet a nagging feeling told me she wouldn't pass up the opportunity to impose her presence. Saturday dawned bright and warm. Nathan was thrilled, waking early to plan out what games he wanted to try. I tossed a picnic blanket in the car, along with extra water bottles. Part of me was eager for a day of fun too. Maybe I'd reconnect with the sense of camaraderie I once felt in the service, only this time with regular neighbors instead of enlisted men. When we arrived at the Riverside Park, the place buzzed with energy. Families dotted the grass, kids raced around with balloons, and vendors sold everything from grilled corn to homemade lemonade. A local band played upbeat tunes. Nathan's eyes shone with excitement. We didn't see Karen at first. I let out a small sigh of relief, hoping maybe she decided to skip the event. Nathan steered his wheelchair toward a ring toss booth, determined to win a stuffed bear. A small group of children invited him to join, greeting him with friendly curiosity rather than the hostility we'd come to expect from Karen. As he played, I drifted a few steps away, keeping him in my line of sight but giving him independence. A wave of gratitude coursed through me. This was exactly what I wanted for him. Normal childhood experiences, free from intimidation. Then, amidst the chatter and laughter, I spotted her. Karen stood near a food stall, arms crossed, scanning the crowd. It took her less than a minute to notice me. Our eyes locked, and I saw her sneer. So she was here, after all. I wasn't about to let her ruin our day. I stayed close to Nathan, making light conversation with nearby families. For a stretch of time, it felt almost normal. A couple of kids cheered Nathan on when he hooked 2 rings in a row. He grinned, reveling in the camaraderie. But Karen was never far away. I kept catching glimpses of her, moving through the crowd like a vulture circling prey. I tried to relax myself. She wouldn't dare cause a scene in such a public place. Wasn't that too brazen, even for her? I got my answer soon enough. Nathan finished at the ring toss and rolled toward a table offering face painting. I trailed behind, nodding hello to folks passing by. Suddenly, Karen stepped in front of us, phone raised. She aimed it directly at Nathan, as though filming some bizarre documentary. Nathan froze, unsettled by the invasive lens. "Excuse me," I said, stepping between them. "Is there a reason you're recording my son?" Karen lowered the phone to her chest, her sneer deepening. "He's at a public event," she said dismissively. "I'm documenting the festival. I have every right." "That's not documenting," I retorted. "That's harassment." She shrugged. "Don't be so sensitive. If you don't like it, maybe keep him at home." The venom behind those words sent a flare of rage through me. Nathan spoke up, voice shaky. "You're making me uncomfortable." Karen's only response was a tight-lipped smile, as if to say that was exactly her goal. A few onlookers whether to intervene. My pulse hammered, but I kept my cool. "We'll be on our way," I said, guiding Nathan around her. I refused to give her the explosive confrontation she seemed to want. We settled near the riverbank where the grass was softer, hoping some distance from the main booths would give Nathan a chance to enjoy the scenery without Karen breathing down our necks. A group of families had spread out blankets there, sharing snacks and conversation. The gentle breeze and bright sun almost lulled me into thinking we could still salvage the day. Nathan exhaled, fiddling with the controls on his chair. "Dad, she's worse than any bully at my old school," he said. "It's like she hates me." My heart clenched. "She's got issues," I replied quietly, "but she can't stop us from living our lives." We stayed there, chatting and watching the river current sparkle under the sun. Kids played tag a short distance away, and I even saw Linda wave from across the lawn. It felt like a small oasis of peace in an otherwise tense situation. Then a commotion broke out near the food stalls. I turned my head, spotting Karen in an argument with a volunteer who looked flustered. They waved their arms with Karen jabbing a finger into the air. I muttered, "She can't go a day without drama, can she?" Nathan gave a shaky laugh. "At least she's distracted." If only it had stayed that way. Moments later, Karen separated from the volunteer and stalked toward the river. I watched her approach, heart sinking. She was headed in our direction. Her posture was that of someone who decided to escalate at all costs. The chatter around us faded in my mind, replaced by the pounding of my heartbeat. Nathan gripped the arms of his wheelchair. "Dad." I moved closer to him, ready to intercede if she tried anything. Karen slowed her steps, scanning the families. Then her gaze landed on Nathan, and the corner of her mouth twitched in a twisted sort of smile. That was my final warning. With a sudden burst of movement, Karen lunged past me, hands seizing the push handles on Nathan's chair. He shouted, startled. I dove forward, reaching for her arm, but she twisted away like she'd been planning this. My fingertips brushed the fabric of her sleeve, not enough to stop her. She gave the wheelchair a savage shove toward the slope, leading straight to the water. "Stop!" I roared, but gravity had already taken hold. Nathan cried out, his arms flailing to gain control of the wheels, but the incline was too steep, and momentum carried him over the grass. The chair bounced, jostling him dangerously. I sprinted after him, every muscle in my body fueled by panic and rage. The river lay just beyond a small embankment. If he hit the water strapped in, time slowed to a crawl. I could see the exact moment the wheelchair's front wheels hit uneven ground. It tipped, ejecting Nathan forward. He landed hard as the chair itself tumbled into the shallow edge of the river. The splash reverberated through my ears, and I felt my stomach drop. Nathan managed to unclip the belt halfway, but not fully. The swirling water threatened to pull the chair, and him, deeper. I reached the spot just seconds after, throwing myself into the river without hesitation. My boots sank into the muddy bottom, water soaking my clothes in an instant. I saw Nathan's terrified face as he struggled against the partial restraint. With a burst of adrenaline, I yanked the belt open and hauled him upright. He coughed, sputtering river water, hands clinging to my jacket. All around us there were shouts, families yelling, children crying. I heard Linda's voice somewhere in the chaos, calling my name. For a split second, I locked eyes with Nathan. His expression of pure panic tore at my heart, but it also ignited a protective fury I'd never felt before. I lifted him free of the water, cradling him against my chest, and trudged back onto the bank. My lungs burned, my pulse thundered, but he was alive. We collapsed onto the grass, both of us drenched and trembling. Nathan coughed violently, spitting out water. I shouted for someone to call 911, pressing a hand to my son's back, feeling the convulsions of his lungs. A small cluster of bystanders rushed over, offering help. Someone threw a blanket around Nathan. My pulse still pounded with an almost deafening roar. I looked up, scanning for Karen. She stood a few yards away, phone raised, filming us like we were some bizarre spectacle. A wave of raw fury crashed into me. She just pushed my disabled son into the river, and now she had the audacity to record our trauma as though it were entertainment. "Are you out of your mind?" I shouted, staggering to my feet. Water streamed down my shirt, dripping into my eyes. I stepped forward, fists clenched, but a couple of onlookers stepped between us, anxious to prevent a full-blown altercation. Karen's face was blank, almost triumphant. "You saw how," he said in a chillingly calm tone, flipping her phone's camera to show me a snippet of video. "He's not exactly stable in that chair, is he?" My vision went red. I wanted to grab that phone and hurl it into the river. Instead, I forced myself to kneel back down beside Nathan, who was coughing raggedly. A paramedic team arrived minutes later, rushing to our side. As the paramedics worked to stabilize Nathan, a hush fell over the crowd. Some people muttered angrily about Karen. Others looked at me with a mix of sympathy and shock. The paramedics checked Nathan's vitals, loading him onto a stretcher so they could take him to the hospital for an evaluation. I turned to the nearest police officer, who had arrived alongside the paramedics. My voice trembled with rage. "She pushed him," I said, pointing at Karen. "She tried to drown my son." The officer, a sturdy man with a calm demeanor, raised a hand. "Sir, I need you to give me your statement. But first, is your son okay?" I glanced at Nathan, who gave me a small nod between coughs. My focus returned to the officer. "He's breathing, but she..." The officer nodded. "I understand. We have witnesses reporting that Miss Karen forced the wheelchair downhill. We're going to talk to them, collect footage, whatever we can. Right now, your priority is your kid." He was right. I climbed into the ambulance, gripping Nathan's hand. We rode to the hospital in tense silence, the siren blaring overhead. Nathan was safe, but my thoughts whirled. Karen had done more than just talk. She'd gone from making thinly veiled threats about property values to attempting to hurt, or kill, my son. I could barely process the escalation. Hours later, after the hospital confirmed that Nathan hadn't sustained any major injuries beyond bruises and mild inhalation of water, I felt an overwhelming surge of relief. He was shaken, soaked, but alive. A doctor recommended a short stay for observation just to be certain. Nathan seemed more worried about me than himself. While he rested, I slipped out to call the police station. They wanted a full statement. My hair was still damp, and the hospital hallway felt cold. As I recounted Karen's actions over the phone, including her repeated harassment and the final push, my anger roiled. How could anyone be so cruel? The officer on the other end listened attentively. "We have her in custody right now," he said. "She's claiming it was an accident, that your son lost control of his chair on the slope." I let out a harsh laugh. "She literally shoved him. Plenty of people saw. We've spoken to a few witnesses who back up your story, sir. And we've confiscated her phone. A partial video is there, but it's not the entire incident. We're looking into more footage from bystanders, A hot tear slipped down my cheek, equal parts relief and fury. "Thank you," I managed, voice tight. "I'll come to the station as soon as Nathan's cleared." By the time I arrived at the station the next day, I was running on minimal sleep, fueled by a simmering desire for justice. Karen was nowhere in sight when I got there. An officer said she'd been released on bail. My stomach twisted at the idea of her walking free, even for a short time, but I had no choice. The legal process was in motion. I gave a detailed statement to a detective, starting from Karen's initial confrontation over the moving truck to the ramp argument, and finally the near-drowning incident at the festival. Each memory felt like a weight pressing down on me, but I forced myself to be thorough. This was my best chance to hold her accountable. The detective nodded gravely. "We've got a strong case," he said. "Multiple eyewitnesses say they saw her push the chair. Some phone footage, plus the paramedics' report about your son's condition." A shaky exhale left my lips. "Thank God," I muttered. He offered a sympathetic nod. "I understand how difficult this is. We're going to file charges of reckless endangerment, or possibly more, depending on the DA's decision." I left the station feeling marginally calmer. Karen would face the law, but deep down I knew this was far from over. She was the type who believed she was untouchable, someone who'd weaponize even the slightest loophole. I promised myself I wouldn't stop fighting until she was stopped for good. Back at the hospital, Nathan was waiting with Linda, who'd come by to keep him company. The second I stepped into the room, he asked, "Dad, is Karen going to jail?" "She's been charged," I said, forcing a reassuring tone. "It might take time, but she'll face consequences." Nathan's shoulders relaxed slightly. Linda handed me a small homemade card decorated with cheerful doodles. "A few neighbors asked me to give this to you," she said softly. "They wanted you both to know they're on your side." I opened it and found notes of support. Apologies for not intervening sooner. Promises to testify if needed. My chest tightened with emotion. "Tell them thank you." "I appreciate it." Linda smiled, though her gaze flicked to Nathan's bruised arms. "We never imagined she'd do something so monstrous." Nathan just looked away, silent. I could tell he was replaying the scene in his head. That night, as I stayed beside his hospital bed, I held his hand and told him everything would be okay. Inside, I wrestled with guilt for not having prevented the attack, for not anticipating Karen's leap from harassment to violence. But there was no going back. All I could do was stand firm now, ensuring she couldn't harm him again. A few days later, we took Nathan home. The ramp I'd built loomed large as we pulled into the driveway, once a symbol of hopeful progress, now a reminder of the conflict that nearly took his life. Still, the modifications allowed him to navigate the house comfortably, and for that, I was grateful. I expected Karen to show up, spewing more hateful remarks, but her house across the street was dark, blinds drawn. According to Linda, a relative of Karen's came to pick up her mail while Karen stayed elsewhere. The rumor was that she was too ashamed to face the neighborhood, though I suspected it was more about avoiding confrontation before her court date. In her absence, we tried to reclaim some sense of normalcy. Nathan resumed his daily routines, light exercises, online schoolwork, weekend video games. I hovered like a protective hawk, checking every window, scanning the street. He noticed my unease. One afternoon he said, "Dad, you don't have to watch over me every second." I forced a smile. "I know. Just making sure everything's safe." He sighed, and for a moment the heartbreak in his eyes was undeniable. "I'm scared too. But if we let her control our lives even when she's not here, she still wins." That simple statement from my son struck me harder than any barked order I'd heard in the military. He was right. Weeks passed and we heard next to nothing from Karen. Legal proceedings. My statements were on record, witnesses had been interviewed, and the DA was building the case for trial. Linda mentioned that Karen was trying to rally the HOA board to declare the ramp unapproved, presumably to undermine my credibility. But the rest of the board was no longer keen to side with a woman charged with pushing a child into a river. In fact, several neighbors formed an informal committee to support accessibility improvements around Whitewood Lane. They thanked me for standing up to Karen, saying they'd put up with her micromanaging for years. I realized that while my situation was extreme, it had finally spurred them to act. If there was a silver lining, perhaps it was that her cruelty exposed how broken the HOA's power structure had become. Meanwhile, Nathan began seeing a therapist to process the trauma. He'd wake in the night sometimes, breathing hard, reliving the sensation of rolling down that slope. I'd hold him until he calmed. I told him that in training soldiers, I never saw courage like his, facing fear and carrying on. It wasn't empty praise. He truly amazed me. One day, a marked envelope arrived from the courthouse, summoning me as a witness for the upcoming trial against Karen. My stomach churned at the official tone. Nathan was included too, though the DA said he might not have to testify if the evidence was strong enough. I told Nathan about the notice. He went quiet, then asked, "Dad, do I have to see her again?" I hesitated. "There's a chance you might, but I'll do everything I can to make sure you're safe." He looked down at his hands, picking at a loose thread on his pants. "I'll testify if I have to. I want to look her in the eye and let her know she didn't beat us." My throat tightened. Nathan's resilience humbled me. He'd gone from a terrified boy in the river to a determined kid who refused to let a bully define his life. "We'll face her together," I promised. The morning of the trial arrived with a chill in the air. I dressed in a pressed shirt, though I couldn't help but recall my drill instructor days, where uniforms and discipline were paramount. Today, discipline meant staying calm in a courtroom instead of on a training ground. Nathan opted to stay in the waiting area with a counselor who specialized in helping minors through legal proceedings. Linda was there too, ready to offer moral support. As I entered the courtroom, I spotted Karen at the defense table. She wore a conservative suit, her hair styled neatly, trying to appear respectable. Her gaze flicked up when I walked in. For a heartbeat, our eyes locked. She looked away first. The prosecutor laid out the charges: assault on a disabled minor, reckless endangerment, and more. My testimony covered our entire history with Karen. I spoke about the ramp, her constant harassment, and the final act by the river. At times, my voice shook. It was one thing to recount it in a formal setting, reliving the horror of seeing Nathan nearly drown. Karen's lawyer tried to poke holes, insinuating that my military background might make me aggressive or prone to exaggeration. The line of questioning stung, but I kept my composure, answering firmly. The moment they brought up the phone footage, however, my anger simmered again. I explained how Karen filmed Nathan struggling in the water instead of helping. When the prosecution called witnesses, my anger was tempered by gratitude. Multiple neighbors testified, including people I'd never spoken to, but who had been at the festival. One by one, they recounted seeing Karen's hands on the wheelchair, the deliberate shove. Several had filmed from different angles, capturing her smirk, her total lack of concern. Linda took the stand too, describing Karen's hostility in the days leading up to the event, her obsession with the ramp, and her vocal complaints about children who don't fit the neighborhood image. She painted a damning picture of Karen's mindset. Karen's lawyer tried to spin it as a misunderstanding, an unfortunate accident during a heated moment. But the onlookers' videos left no room for doubt. She had deliberately pushed Nathan. The defense's weak arguments about lack of intent rang hollow when confronted with the visual evidence. Nathan was spared from testifying thanks to the overwhelming evidence. The prosecutor decided it wasn't necessary to subject him to cross-examination. I felt a rush of relief at that, knowing how hard it would be for him to face Karen in person. Nonetheless, he stayed in the waiting room, wanting to be present if something changed. At the trial's conclusion, I watched the jury file out, hearts pounding collectively as we awaited a verdict. Karen sat stiffly, arms crossed, eyes glued to the table. I flashed back to the day she confronted me about my moving truck, how she'd looked so self-assured, believing herself untouchable. Now she seemed smaller, her arrogance eroded by the mountain of evidence. When the verdict came, guilty on multiple counts, a murmur spread through the courtroom. Karen's lawyer placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, but she yanked away, face twisted in rage. She looked at me then, eyes full of venom. I stared back, feeling both vindication and a pang of sadness. Her obsession had brought her to this dark end, and she had no one to blame but herself. Outside the courthouse, I found Nathan waiting with Linda. The moment he saw my face, he knew. "They found her guilty," I said quietly. A spark of relief flickered in his expression. "So, she won't come back?" "That's up to the sentencing," I explained. "But yes, she'll be serving time, and she'll be under strict orders not to come near us." Nathan let out a long breath. Linda squeezed my arm in a gesture of support. "I'm so glad justice was served," she said. "This neighborhood can finally breathe." Those words struck me. Whitewood Lane wasn't just about my fight against Karen. It was also a tyranny. I saw neighbors in the hallway, whispering excitedly about the verdict, some even hugging each other. It was a surreal scene. But in that moment, I realized how many lives she'd tried to control. Over the next weeks, Karen's sentencing hearing approached. The district attorney aimed for the maximum penalty possible, given that her victim was a disabled minor. I, too, wrote a detailed impact statement, describing how Nathan's life had been upended by her actions. Nathan decided not to attend that hearing, opting instead to focus on moving forward. I understood completely. He didn't need to see her face again, or hear whatever excuses she'd present in a last-ditch effort for leniency. On sentencing day, I sat in the courtroom's gallery. Karen stood before the judge, flanked by her lawyer. She tried to claim remorse, but it rang hollow after the judge read the trial transcripts highlighting her cold behavior. The judge handed down a prison term, plus mandatory counseling and a heavy fine. As the bailiff led Karen away, she shot me a hateful glare. I felt no pity. She had done this to herself. With Karen gone, a palpable weight lifted from Whitewood Lane. Neighbors who once tiptoed around her discovered they could engage in normal community activities without fear of being ticketed or reprimanded. The HOA organized a special meeting to vote in a new president, and Linda became a frontrunner. She was unanimously chosen, eager to usher in a friendlier set of policies. Nathan's recovery, both physical and emotional, became my top priority. Freed from Karen's looming presence, he grew more confident, venturing outside on his own and chatting with kids in the neighborhood. The ramp, once derided as an eyesore, became a point of pride for several families who praised us for standing up for accessibility. Some even planned to install ramps or railings for aging relatives. I never expected such a shift in mindset so quickly, but it showed me how one oppressive voice could silence an entire community, until someone finally said, "Enough." Months later, the neighborhood felt transformed. Linda organized a block party to celebrate the newly revised HOA guidelines. Tables lined the street, laden with homemade dishes. Kids played catch, and folks laughed as they admired each other's decorations without nitpicking petty details. Nathan navigated the festivities comfortably, sometimes rolling beside me, sometimes chasing after other kids who zoomed around on bikes. I spotted a man with a cane who'd been reluctant to attend community events before. Now he was out mingling, leaning on a new railing by the sidewalk that had been installed to make things safer for everyone. I stood by the grill, flipping burgers, soaking in the sense of unity. My mind drifted to Karen once or twice, wondering if she ever regretted her actions. Part of me doubted she'd admit fault, but it no longer mattered. She wasn't here, and her reign was over. One evening, after everyone had gone home, Nathan and I sat on our porch. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in streaks of orange and pink. He gazed at the ramp, tapping a wheel on his chair thoughtfully. "Dad, remember how I used to be so excited about that ramp? Then it became this big symbol of conflict with Karen." I nodded, sipping from a cup of tea. "Yeah, it's seen a lot, hasn't it?" He turned to me, a slight grin on his face. "Now it's just our ramp. I can go in and out of the house whenever I want. No big deal." A soft chuckle escaped me. "That's how it should be, no big deal." We fell into a comfortable silence, the events of the past months drifting like shadows on a winding path behind us. My mind replayed the moment I dove into the river, arms desperate to catch him before the current pulled him under. It was still a haunting memory, but it carried a new significance. It proved we'd do anything to protect each other. Life moved on. The local news covered Karen's sentencing as a cautionary tale about HOA overreach and discrimination. A few reporters reached out, but I kept interviews to a minimum, not wanting to sensationalize Nathan's ordeal. Instead, I focused on the bright future we had here: an accessible home, friendly neighbors, and no more watchful eyes waiting to pounce on every perceived violation. Nathan continued his therapy sessions, though they tapered off as he regained his confidence. He told me one day he wanted to grow up to be an advocate for people with disabilities, ensuring no one would face what he faced. My pride nearly overwhelmed me. Our story might sound extreme, a neighbor so obsessed with standards that she tried to harm a child. But in my years as a drill instructor, I learned extremes happen more often than we think. Authority can corrupt people. Fear can keep communities silent. All it takes is a pushback, literal or metaphorical, to topple a bully's house of cards. And so, we stay vigilant. We live our daily routines in peace, yes, but we remember the lessons we learned. We greet newcomers to Whitewood Lane, assuring them this is a welcoming place. We share our experiences quietly, reminding folks that if anyone tries to mimic Karen's path, they'll find a united neighborhood ready to defend what's right. Nathan wheels down our porch ramp every morning for fresh air, unafraid of lurking eyes or sudden shoves. I stand by him, not as a watchful guard, but as a father proud of his son's resilience. The intimidation is gone, replaced by a sense of calm that feels all the sweeter because we earned it. I'll never forget the day Karen pushed my boy into the river, phone in hand like she was documenting her victory. But that moment no longer haunts me. It fuels me to stand up against injustice, whether in a training camp or a suburban street. And whenever I see a ramp, I remember that our fight wasn't just about my son's right to access our home. It was about refusing to let one twisted mind dictate who deserves to live peacefully. In the end, we proved that no matter how loud bullies shout about property values or standards, the most powerful voice belongs to a community banding together and a father protecting his child. Karen lost, and we won something priceless: freedom from her tyranny, and a permanent reminder that a decent neighborhood is measured by how it embraces those who need acceptance the most.